Rome, as we talked about last time, grew steadily, but in the 3rd century, pretty much, it took over the entire Italian peninsula. But also in the 3rd century, it came face to face with another civilization. It's called the Carthaginian, right here, the town of Carthage. And the Carthaginians, you see, at this point were masters of half of Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica. And then the other half were the Greeks. So now that Rome has possessed itself of the entire boot, it needed to have Sicily, and there first it came into contact with the Greeks. Later it will come obviously into conflict with the Carthaginians. And in terms of art, one can almost pinpoint the year where the madness for everything Greek overcame the Romans, and the year was 211, and that's when the city of Syracuse, down in the south, was conquered by Romans. And the man was Marcus Marcellus. He is the general who captured Syracuse. And this was in the process of fighting with Carthage, but we'll talk about it separately. And it was in this year, in the year 211, in fact, that he brought to Rome, in his triumph, he was granted a triumph by the Roman Republic. Usually no one is allowed, except lictors, no one is allowed to wear arms inside of Rome. But in order to distinguish a great general, the general is allowed to drive into Rome in a gilded chariot driven by 4 snow-white horses, and then behind him would walk the captured, and also wagons and wagons and wagons of loot. And that was considered legal because winner takes all. The thing is that conquest was just an integral part of the Roman idea of themselves as it evolved. And conquesting they went. So in this case, Marcellus brought back wagons and wagons and wagons of loot. And this is the first time when someone brought back statues or paintings or pieces of art. Until that wasn't the case. The captives they would bring back, but they would leave their statues to themselves. In this case, Syracuse was an extremely wealthy Greek town with presumably spectacular artistic examples. And all of that was brought to Rome. And when the Romans saw the beauty of these statues, the beauty of that art, they, literally that was the moment when they swung over, when they were captured themselves by the beauty of the Greeks and the beauty of the Greek art. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a very significant group of the Romans who very much feared that this new love of lovely things will weaken the spirit of a Roman soldier, of a Roman in general, will compromise the original values of thrift, of honesty, of simplicity. Because that was considered the true Roman virtues, and they were right. In fact, that's exactly what will happen. It was extraordinary, in fact, how fast Romans went from sort of very Spartan attitudes towards life to
having a sense of humor.
To having a sense of humor, yes, exactly. Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Yes, sense of humor was not part of the Roman character. I mean, the Roman was hard. A Roman was firm, disciplined, frugal. That was the nature of a Roman. So they felt that this was very much compromising the firmness of Roman's original nature. But it did happen, and there was nothing for it. As I said, because conquest was in so much the part of the Roman makeup, the larger the larger they grew and the stronger they grew, the more they got involved then in Eastern politics. And the Eastern world was a world by itself, and consisting of a number of kingdoms. And one of the wars that ensued was between the Romans and the Macedonians, and in the conquest of Greece. And by the middle of the 2nd century, Greece will be conquered. Another general who was distinguished in that is Titus Flavinius, and again from the 3rd to the 2nd century. And he did something interesting, and which could only be possible outside of Rome, because the Romans, after the Etruscans, were so keen on keeping even the spirit of kingdom away from them. They would never allow a coin minted with an image of a living person. Their coins had gods on them. I mean, one of the problems with Julius Caesar was he was the first, in fact, to mint a coin with his own image on it while he was alive, and that did not sit well. But here is our Titus Flaminius, who, while he is in Macedonia, in Greece, he in fact had a coin minted with his own image, which of course is a boon for us, because then we know kind of what he looked like. And here he is, and his hair is all tousled, and he wears a beard in a Greek fashion, because the Romans were clean shaven. And then on the other side is the goddess Nike crowning the general, of course, for his victories. But he was fluent. He in fact was fluent in Greek and was a great admirer of Greek culture, and the Greeks hailed him as their liberator, and as such. But in the East it was much more common to have coins minted with the image of a living person. And here is one of the first patricians, first generals who admired Greek culture, learned the Greek language, and well, had his coin minted there. But this coin was, of course, not accepted in Rome.
It's also the interesting beginnings of a kind of worrying trend. Worrying in that it's just the Republic was kind of almost trying to swim against the current, in the sense that these great, extraordinary men were just not appreciated in this heart of Rome, because where everyone was equal and where everyone was of one status regardless of merit, they simply could not achieve the heights they wanted to, because they'd always have littler men putting spokes in their wheels.
That's
and
true.
Rather than admiring them for their great achievements, would either resent them or nitpick their birth. You see the trend begin where men just felt more comfortable
Elsewhere.
Away from Rome, because away from Rome they could actually grow. They could actually have their merits recognized. They could stretch their ambitions in ways that were suffocated in their own mother country in a very resentful building way.
Right.
And it's just a whisper at this point. It's a simple coin,
Right.
minted far away.
Yes.
It's very interesting, just this beginning
Yeah.
whisper
Sure.
of discontent
Right.
among the talented, the bold.
Still another general who was also part of this fight against the Macedonians was one Emilios Palace. And this is very interesting because he was involved in the so-called Battle of Pydna, and this is one of the battles between the Greeks and the Macedonians. And the story goes that there was a clairvoyant, a seer, predicted that the side that initiated the battle will lose. So as a result, both sides stood in front of one another, and neither wanted to initiate the battle. At which point, one of the Roman horses broke loose and began to gallop towards the Macedonian side, and Macedonians felt that that was the Romans started the battle, so they advanced. And the Macedonians ultimately lost, because in fact it was the Macedonians who started the battle. So what's interesting about this, the two details of the same frieze. I mean, the frieze is an architectural decoration. It could be either on top of the building or at any part of the building, really. And in the Parthenon, it's at the top. In Pergamon, it's at the bottom. But here it is, and it's very much in the Greek tradition. It's done very much in the Greek tradition, and it's done in high relief. Well, it's from low to high relief. Now, relief, in sculptural relief, is when a block of stone is carved to a certain degree. It could be carved very lightly, as you see here with that leg, or it could be carved much deeper or higher, as you see with the torso here. But it is not a sculpture in the round. It's not a sculpture that one can walk around. It's a relief from the wall, and that's why it's called a sculptural relief. And the Greeks used it extensively, and this is the example of such. And it shows a battle. This is still very much the expression of one-to-one combat, which is how battles were portrayed at the time. But what's really significant here, well, there's one horse that's falling down, but look at this horse. Look at this horse that kind of turns. It's riderless, and it seems that that's the very horse that broke the ranks and galloped ahead, right there. And what's interesting about that is even though the sculptors are obviously Greeks, but the technique is very much Greek. But the fascinating part is that while the Greeks, they wouldn't depict the battle itself, but would, for instance, depict a great battle between the gods and the Titans, or between the Greeks and the Amazons, to commemorate a certain battle that they won. They would use their own mythology as a generic manifestation of a great battle won. Whereas with the difference here is that it seems, we don't know exactly, but it seems as if the Romans here have commissioned Greek artists to commemorate a certain event, as opposed to the Greek habit of doing something else. So that's the interesting part. And here's the horse. There it is. And there's no rider anywhere in sight. Another thing that developed in Rome, you see, in the middle of the 2nd century, they conquered Greece, and they inherited 500 years of Greek civilization and Greek advance in art in one fell swoop. So what they could do now is mix and match. They could do what the French call the Russian salad, where everything, just whatever you have in your refrigerator, goes into it. And that's what the Romans now could do. Well, with architecture, as we saw, when they borrowed both from the Etruscans and from Rome and from the Greeks. And now they're doing it the same thing with sculpture. There was only so many examples of original Greek sculpture by certain remarkable sculptors, and those were usually in bronze, because Greeks preferred to sculpt to use bronze, whereas Romans now had to use marble, and all sorts of shops now sprung up both in Greece under the Romans and in Rome also for copying. And they used these sort of mechanical arms that would mark the original sculpture, or as close to the original as possible, and then transfer the points from one to the other to come as close as possible to the original. Which is why we so many brilliant Greek sculpture we know only from the Roman copies, and then of course they can't compare to the original, but at least we know them, and that's wonderful in itself. We have, one can really count on two hands the original Greek bronzes by significant artists. I think one hand, in fact, if that. We just don't have that. We know we have all of them through the Roman copies. But then now that they were producing these sculptures on the conveyor line, essentially, because everybody wanted them, they began to combine the sculptures. And here is a great case in point. There was one Pasitylus, not to be confused with Praxiteles. Praxiteles was a great Greek sculptor who lived in the middle of the 4th century. This one is Pasitylus, who lived in the 1st century BC and had a shop, I think, near Rome somewhere. And it is from his shop that so many of these sculptures emerged, and this is a great example, because all three of these sculptures, the 1, the 2, and 3, come from completely different sources. The central figure pretty much harkens back to Polyclatus. Polyclatus was one of the great sculptors in Greece who lived in the 5th century BC. And he was the first to sculpt this so-called Doryphorus, the spear bearer, because this sculpture presumably he had in his left hand had a spear that laid on his shoulder, and this sculpture originally was bronze and called the canon. This was the canon of male perfection, the canon of balance, of harmony, which was so important to the Greeks. He wrote a treatise on the subject, but the treatise did not survive. So at any rate, all the further sculptures, and we will see it as well, will be based, male sculptures, whether dressed or undressed, will be based to a great degree on the Doryphorus. So the central figure is very much harkens back to the Doryphorus. Now this figure on our left harkens back to a completely different sculpture, and it's called Apollo, the lizard killer. Now this one is by Praxiteles. Praxiteles is 4th century BC. So this one was created 100 years later, also in bronze, presumably, the original. And it's called Apollo, the lizard killer by Praxiteles. And several 1st and 2nd century Roman copies survived. And as you see, they're all very, very different. They depict a nude about to catch a lizard that climbs up the tree. And that type of a nude also became very popular. So here we now have the combination of the Doryphorus and the lizard slayer. But that's not the only thing. Later on, the Emperor Hadrian had a companion, a lover of remarkable beauty, and his name was Antinos. He was a Greek youth from Bithynia, and once Hadrian encountered him, he never let him go, and Antinos accompanied him everywhere he went. And then, strangely, he drowned in the Nile while the two of them were in Egypt, and no one knows the reasons for that. So Hadrian consequently deified him, and in fact founded a town, Antinopolis, in Egypt, with the temple, with the priesthood dedicated to the worship of Antinos. And his face, that head of his, became famous throughout the empire. So what we see here, this is the original sculpture, presumably goes back to the second half of 1st century BC, but sometime after the 1st century AD, the head was replaced, and the head of Antinos was in fact attached to this. And then the last but not the least is this sculpture here, and this is more of an archaic sculpture. Now, I mentioned that the history of Rome, remember, is divided into the Republican and the Imperial part. The Republican from about 500 to the year 0, Imperial from the year 0 to about the year 500. And now the history of Greece is divided into 3 parts, very roughly. And the period between 800 and the year 500 BC, that's archaic period, the older period. And then the 5th century, the 5th and part of the 4th century, it's called classical or Hellenic. And then the 3rd part, after the death of Alexander in 323 BC, called Hellenistic. Now, in the archaic period, the sculpture was characterized by rigidity, straightforwardness. So this particular female form is sort of archaistic. And here, the most famous example, they're called Cariateans. The most famous example is the temple of Neptune in Athens, on the Acropolis. Acropolis is the ancient site of the religious center of ancient Athens, and these are the most famous Cariateans. The female, it's an Ionic order, because as you see, there are no triglyphs, it's a continuous frieze. So it is an Ionic order, but instead of the columns, you have these females, and they're called Cariateans. So what you have in the end, in this image on the left, you have a combination of all of those. You have the Apollo the Lizard Slayer, you have, which was originated in the 4th century BC, you have the Ripharus from the 5th century BC, you have the Cariateans that go back to, again, 6th century, and then Antinos, who was Hadrian's friend, and that's 2nd century AD. All of this is combined in this sculpture. Granted, the head will be added later, so there was a different head there. But there's one youth, and he is lighting some sort of a fire with his torch, because it is a marble sculpture, and marble is extremely heavy, and it's precarious to just have a marble statue stand on its 2 legs, because it may keel over. So very often there is a support, and in this case, this archaistic, shall we say, Cariatid is serving as a support, and then next to him is another youth who is inspired by the lizard slayer. So this was very common in Rome, because they could, as I said, they could mix and match anything they wanted now. Another interesting example that comes from that time, also from the 2nd century BC, is, it's called the altar of Domitius Ahenobarbus. It's not really an altar, it was probably a base for some sort of a structure where votive sculptures were placed. It was found near the Temple of Neptune in the Field of Mars in Rome. And it's split between Munich and I think the Louvre. Scholars are still debating whether really it came from the same architectural structure, because 2 parts are so different. Now, the man himself, there's a conjecture that he was a Roman admiral, and that also part of the struggle against the Macedonians. And on arriving in Rome, he wished to dedicate a temple to Neptune, the god of the seas. But we don't know. What we have, this base, is composed of 2 very, very different styles. One style you see here, right there, is very Hellenistic, and the Hellenistic period, that period in Greece after the death of Alexander, when at that time, all the styles were beginning to be mixed. The Greek styles and the styles of Syria, the styles of Egypt, the styles of Palestine. Also, life became very different, so there was a lot of this Baroque expression. The expression of emotion, the movements, the flying drapery, the tales of sea creatures swerving around. Whereas the classical Greek attitude to sculpture was balance and harmony, and never undue emotion shown, which is very different from the Hellenistic. So as you see here, this is definitely Hellenistic, and it shows the wedding procession. Now, the way we should look at it is, this is a continuation of this. So you see this hoof of the horse. There it is, right there. So this one is a continuation of that. And this is the wedding procession of Neptune and Amphitrite, and they are surrounded by sea creatures. Everything is very smooth, but at the same time constantly moving and totally, completely energized. And then here is Neptune and his betrothed, the Amphitrite. So this is one side of the so-called altar. And Tritons, as you see, Tritons, they drive the carriage, and they also play music, and they blow their horns, and they're just full of energy. And now suddenly we come to the other side, which is totally different. It does seem as if one part was done by a Greek artist, the other done by a Roman artist, but and as I said, some scholars are still not certain that it really belonged to the same altar, or maybe part of the altar that was done in Greece by the Greeks was then shipped to Rome and recarved. That's also possible, but there's nothing of the energy or undue movement in this one. What we see here is a narrative story also, and this one goes after this, continues. A census is being taken, and at this point census was being taken, and according to the census and according to one's wealth, because one's status very much was determined by one's wealth. So one was ranked as say one hierarchical order or another, and those who did not quite come up to par in terms of wealth would be engaged as soldiers. And at this point, the Romans still they were very proud of being soldiers. And then this is the statue of Mars. So it's not Neptune anymore, it's the statue of Mars, who is the god of war. And there's his altar, the altar of Mars. And to the altar, so there's the bit of Mars. And to the altar, as you see, so this is census, sacrifice to Mars, and enrollment of troops, the back of the altar. And here are brought a bull, a sheep, and a pig. And now the soldiers are prepared, in fact, to go join the ranks. So the whole thing describes the census taking, the sacrifice for the success of future battles, and the sacrifice involves all these three animals, and then departure, in fact, for battle. Reason these are all very important is because we have so little from that period. The entire 1st century BC is going to be civil wars, for the very reasons that Sasha mentioned earlier. Just by this time, Rome had won an empire, and the Republican government that was good enough for a city-state simply was completely inadequate for the empire, and corruption was ubiquitous, and one senator fought against another senator, and one general against another general. So things were not happy. So the majority of art that we have from Rome really begins with the Emperor Augustus, when peace will descend onto Rome, and as such art will be possible on a large scale. But this is why these pieces are important, because that's all we have from before that. And I mean, we don't even have much Roman writing before the 3rd century. They did set up the 12 tables, their laws, in the middle of the 5th century, but that too, of course, we have in copies. But going back to the Romans as they were, these are called, and these also come from the mid-1st century BC, these are called Theoristic Portraits. While the Greeks sculpted the legs of Doryphorus or the Apollo, the lizard slayer, for the Greeks, a man or a body, or a woman for that matter, as a whole mattered. They could not conceive of just cutting off the head and not attaching it to the body. Whereas for the Romans, this was just fine. Well, the Romans themselves never acquired the skill of that balance and harmony that the Greeks were so brilliant at, and they didn't value it either. As I said, for the Romans, the whole thing of beauty, charm, balance, elegance, it wasn't important. What was important for the Romans was knowledge through experience, and that's what mattered tremendously. And they very much believed in the dictum that that we have faces that are given us by God before, say, we are the age of 25 or 30, but then after 40 we definitely have faces that we deserve, and that's what they believed in. And when you look at these faces, these are the faces they were proud of. The more experience showed, the more wrinkled, the uglier, the more true to life, the better. As I said, honesty, forethought, simplicity, frugality, humility, those were the original Roman qualities. which is interesting that these come from the 1st century BC, because by this time these qualities have been very severely compromised among the Romans themselves. And men from these families, there was a custom of making wax masks of the deceased, and in the atriums, in the atria of those great Roman houses, there would always be wooden cabinets that would exhibit those masks. And whenever there would be a celebration or a festival or a procession where a Roman patrician would be accompanied by his clients, some of the clients, in fact, would wear the masks of the ancestors, or they would be just held in hands. With time, the busts now were made in marble of those masks, and of course busts were too heavy to carry. But they too would live in the atrium. So if someone walked in, one immediately was faced with the antiquity of the family and the dignity of the family. It's not much different from walking into these great English houses and seeing portraits and portraits and portraits up the stairwell. It's the same idea. Most of these are of men and charmers, one and all. This presumably is someone by the name of Cato, and he was the leader of the conservative lot who greatly disapproved of the introduction of Greek culture into Rome, because he feared rightly that this would, of course, compromise all those stern qualities of a hard-hearted Roman.
God bless compromise.
I know, right? I mean, look at this, and there's nothing married to this
No,
one.
I don't. Thank you. No, ew.
There's one, I mean, there's one here of a woman, but a woman would be considerably older, and she wears the hairstyle that was very popular at the time. Simple style, just this little bun on top of the head, and then the hair would be tied in the back. This fellow here, the piece of marble, in fact, that was used, you see, had a flaw, it had a vein right there, and a Greek sculptor would immediately discard it because the marble was not perfect. But he had no problems with it. It only added character, and these enormous moles on his eyebrows, they certainly were not taken away. Everything was there. They wanted to be seen as they were. And this is a sculpture, in fact, of a patrician carrying wax masks of his ancestors. I mean, this is all done in marble, just to represent. But this is what it would look like. But as I said, sometimes during the processions, someone would be chosen who resembled perhaps the ancestor in size and would be, in fact, wearing a mask. So this is what the Greeks praised, and what was important to the Greeks, because they felt that the universe, the cosmos, was organized according to very different rules, and these rules involved the very strict rules of mathematics and geometry. So the Greek mind was a very mathematical mind, and it was a very speculative mind, which a Roman mind was not. Speculation was not a Roman a feature of the Roman mind. Experience was, but then the Greeks felt that the beauty of nature, that the beauty of the universe, had to be reflected in architecture, in sculpture, and thus these beautiful balanced bodies, nudes. Whereas this is what was important for the Romans, the experience. But what they did, you see, what the Romans did on a number of occasions, is that they would take the Greek sculpture, especially if that particular sculpture lost its head at some point, and they would attach a Republican portrait to the sculpture. And frankly, as you see here, right there, this is a perfect example, even though I manipulated this one. But this is a perfect example of how ridiculous this thing would be. It wasn't always ridiculous, but very often this is what it looked like, and then it didn't work very well. This is a heuristic face, even though it's not particularly wrinkled. It is wrinkled, but one has to come quite closely to see that it's wrinkled. But it has very large ears. The head is not of a right proportion. It's considerably larger. than true proportion would call for. The ears, again, very large, and this is actually a face of, say, a 45-year-old man, so it would not be of a 60-year-old man, but a 45-year-old man, whereas the Greeks always used young faces on their young bodies. So the body here is young, but the face, in fact, is that of a 40 plus. It's early 1st century BC. He's called pseudo-athlete, and it's a nude sculpture in marble, and as you see, it has something to lean upon because it's marble. Obviously, bronze is very heavy as well, but bronze sculptures were done of statues were done in a so-called lost wax technique. The technique is not lost; it's the wax that melts out and gets lost as the molten bronze gets poured in, but it's hollow inside. So as heavy as it is, it's not as heavy as a solid marble statue of the same size. So a bronze statue can in fact be attached by its two feet, its two legs, and stay in place. Whereas with marble it's much more precarious, so it needs support. And in this case, here you see the support. This is a copy, so as a result, of course, there is this connection between the arm and the leg, which would not have been there, of course, because for the Greeks, they needed to have everything perfect, and this is not. Here's another. It's called the Tivoli General, and you can see it better here. This is definitely an older face, even though the body itself is rather massive. So it goes better, but still, it's from the sanctuary of Hercules, and in this case, the general, whoever he was, had a degree of modesty apparently, and did not want himself sculpted entirely in the nude. His cuirass is next to him, which also serves as a support for the sculpture, and his cape hides his nudity. His typical republican stern and wrinkled face is contrasted by a youthful, almost nude body. This presumably is the portrait of Pompeius the Great, who was a general in the 1st century BC, and at first a friend of Caesar, and then a rival of Caesar. We're quite certain that that's him because, again, coins were minted with his visage, and as a result we can compare and assert that it's him. Small eyes, sort of bulbous nose, and the hair worn in the style of Alexander of Macedonia, whom he felt he was the heir of. It was Pompey who was the first to bring theater to Rome, because we saw a couple of theater complexes last time, but they were all outside of Rome. The group of the conservative patricians, led by Cato and then his family, was very much against building of a Greek theater also, because they again felt that it's very enervating and it weakens the morals. I mean, there was theater in Rome, but it would always be temporary. I mean, the structure would be put up, the stage would be put up, decorated beautifully, but then taken down. But so, and while in Italy and near Rome, the theater structures were already being built, even though disguised as temples. Now, the Pompey was the first to, he had such incredible authority after his victories in the East and his cleaning of the Mediterranean from the pirates. He had such extraordinary authority that he was called Pompey the Great, and that group would do nothing against him. So he insisted and prevailed on building a theater in Rome, and here it is. We talked about theater. I showed you a number of Greek theaters. In this case, the stage is now connected to the cavea. Now, in Greece, the theaters were built on a natural slope, whereas here now the Romans had to construct the cavea itself, and they did it, of course, with cement, as you see. In this case, the temple is there too, but smaller than in the other examples, and it became a whole complex with an enormous peristyle and exhibition halls for Greek art, and libraries and cafes, and it was very much a social center, a hub. and then the theater itself here, of course. On the opposite end of the garden complex was a Curia for political meetings. Senate would often use this building along with a number of temples. In fact, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, he was assassinated at the theater of Pompeii because the Senate house itself was being remodeled. Rome, as you see, is growing, and the theater of Pompeii, in fact, is right there. Today, there's very little left of it, but then later on there'll be more theaters, as you see, and the bathhouses everywhere. This is the race course, Palatine Hill, right there, and the little building here is the Temple of Zeus on the Capitoline. Palatine Hill, Capitoline Hill, and here is the Roman Forum in between, and this is the theater of Pompeii. We come to Julius Caesar. I just mentioned that he was in fact assassinated at the theater of Pompeii. He was born in July, and that's why July is named after him, on the 12th of July, the year 100, and he was assassinated on 15th of March, which the Romans call the Ides of March. The Romans had names for all the numbers. The Ides of March in the year 44. There are a number of busts, and he looks differently. We're used to this case, but then you read that this is a bust from Egypt, which was carved about the year of his death, so under the auspices of Cleopatra, clearly, and that perhaps is the closest that we have to what he looked like. In both of these busts, he has hair, albeit receding hair, but according to Livy, he was balding. As I mentioned before, by the time he came to power, and by the first century BC, the Republican government was entirely dysfunctional, because while it was quite capable of ruling a city-state, it was entirely incapable of ruling an empire. And he obviously was a brilliant man, and during his very early career, and that also happened from the beginning of the first century BC, there were civil wars constantly between rival generals, between senators, between all sorts of forces. And he saw how chaotic and dysfunctional the whole thing became. The Republican machinery had broken down under the weight of imperialism, and the central government completely powerless, and the governors of the faraway states were entirely corrupt and self-promoting. The provinces were transformed into independent principalities under the absolute control of the governors, who were not responsible to anyone, least of all to the Senate, that consisted of very weak men who were all vying for their own wealth. As I said, the simplicity, humility, and endurance were no longer part of the Roman makeup. So now they solved their differences by slaughter and annihilation instead of by discourse. And Julius Caesar, he realized all that. And with a weak central government, political corruption had spiraled out of control, and the status quo had been maintained by a corrupt aristocracy, which saw no need to change a system that had made its members very, very, very rich.
It's like the Republic had started out as a raft, and everyone was very proud of the fact that it was a simple raft. But over time, it had turned into a trireme, and Caesar was basically the one man who stood up, pointed at the wheel, and said, "This is a ship, not a raft, and I'm going to take the wheel to make sure we don't sink." And everyone got angry that he went to the wheel.
It's true. That is true. He was the first Roman, in fact, to strike a coin with his own image. And of course the opposing party, who just wanted the status quo as they established it, began to accuse him of wishing to be a king. And that was anathema to the Romans since the last Etruscan king. And the fact that he minted a coin, well, it was just one of the reasons, minted a coin with his own image showed him as a tyrant. But on the coins, he's not idealized, and it's possible to have an idea of at least what he looked like. On the coins, he always has the reef, because that of course hides the baldness. And on this particular coin, you see a wolf with the she-wolf with the Romulus and Remus. By this time, he was elected dictator for life, because At one point in his career, the situation developed that was so horrific. And there was a clause in the constitution that despite the Republican government, dictatorial powers could be given to one man for the period of instability or war. And then once that's solved, then, like Cincinnatus, for instance, and then once that is solved, Cincinnatus went back to his field. The qualities that we were describing, the honesty, the thrift, the frugality, these are all qualities of a very successful farmer who wants his land to prosper. And that it was, they were not paid. It was honor to them to serve the Republic. And Cincinnatus was the greatest of those, and in one of the struggles in Italy, he was called to arms again from his farm, from his retirement, and was given the dictatorial powers. Now we must remember that dictator at the time did not have the same connotation that someone like Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler has as a result of the 20th century. Was a man who, with a clear vision, who could lead an army to victory and be unhampered by senatorial decision. And that's what he did. The Cincinnatus took up arms, won the victory, and retired back to his farm. Well, they compare George Washington to him. So Julius Caesar was given, at one point he was given dictatorship, but then ultimately was given dictatorship for life. And that's what it says here, Caesar, dictator. He also realized that just as in our lives, sometimes a settlement just grows, and it expands. For instance, when I was in school, all we had was the Princeton Shopping Center and the Quaker Bridge Mall, really. And then I left and came back, whatever, 100 years later, and lo and behold, there's this Mercer Mall and this mall and that mall. There's so many malls. Because the area grew so tremendously with all the businesses that came here from New York or from whatever. Well, same with Rome. Rome that began as a little village now had close to 1 million, and just the old Roman Forum simply wasn't enough. And as a result, he decided to build another forum, in his own name, of course. Caesar was brilliant in every way, including propaganda. Now, the art of propaganda does not have to be ugly. It could in fact be quite beautiful. So this is what remains today of the Caesar's Forum. And unlike the original Roman Forum, to which we will return several times, so you'll know how to orient yourself around it, this now was built very much like the Forum of Pompeii. This was methodical, this was structured, and this had a plan. And at the end of the forum was the temple of Venus Victrix. Now the Julian family, and at some point we'll delve into that as well because it's so fascinating. The Julian family considered itself descendants of one Aeneas. He was a hero of Troy. He was the son of the goddess Venus or Aphrodite, and he was the only survivor after the sack of Troy. And a Roman poet, Virgil, on instruction of Augustus, who will be the first emperor and who will be an adopted son of Caesar, he wrote an epic story about Aeneas, which is very similar to the Homeric story, first of Troy and then of Odysseus. Aeneas, it just reversed. First Aeneas travels around the seas, then he arrives and founds a city, and Romulus and Remus, in fact, are his descendants, and then Julius Caesar is a descendant of Romulus and Remus. These stories evolved over time as Rome needed better and better pedigree. Rome did not just want to present itself to those eastern countries which it conquered as Johnny-come-lately, even though they were, of course, but they wanted to connect themselves to that ancient pedigree of the Eastern kingdoms, and they did so through Aeneas, the hero of Troy. And because his mother was Venus, Julius Caesar therefore considered himself, his family, the Julians, as descendants of Venus. Therefore the temple is dedicated to Venus Victrix, Venus Victorious, and reminding everyone in Rome that Julius Caesar was the descendant of the gods. shops, not only shops, but offices with the temple. As I said, very much like Pompeian forums. This is the original Roman forum. You had seen this slide already, and it grew organically, so it is not organized. There wasn't even a peristyle around it. What they did have, with time, this is the Senate House, and in front of the Senate House was the so-called rostra, where one spoke. And then later on, there's one basilica was added, another basilica was added. There could be another rostra, another platform for speaking. Then Augustus built a temple to Julius Caesar here later. But as you see, the original forum was very hopscotch, and the most important building was the Senate House, right there, and the rostra. So just as with the Roman house, remember, we think about what's most important, these two were the most important. And then this was added all later, and we'll talk about it. And then there are various temples, the temple to Saturn, the temple to Peace, all of these various temples were added later. And then on the Capitol, this is the Capitol, and on top of the Capitol sat the temple of Zeus. But this was Tabularium, a huge office where the official papers were kept. What Julius did now, he built his own this is the second forum, right there, at the back of the Senate House. So this is where this is. And just so, don't get nervous, here it is. Now, I'm getting dizzy myself. This is the original forum. This is the original Roman forum. And then various basilicas and temples built around it. But this is it. This is the Senate House, right there, and the rostra. So those two are the important. And this is the forum of Julius Caesar. So these were the original ones. All of this will be built later, and we'll talk about it as we proceed. But that's the most important for us now. The original forum and the forum of Julius. Again, they're all right there. All these the Julius's forum, in fact, is that little rectangle, right there. Again, just so you see, this is the Palatine Hill and the Capitoline Hill. There is the original forum. These pictures don't show the Julian forum yet. They show the Senate House. There's the Senate House, and then the Julian forum will be right there. And here it is. Again, the Senate House is right here, the Senate House. The rostra is there, and then the Julian forum is here. All of this will be built later. And don't worry that if you don't understand where things are, you will when we get to it. Today, when one goes to Rome, the Romans do something very interesting. They take you on a tour, on the guided tour, with these lighting, with the recreated lighting of the forum. They kind of show you what it may have looked like. Just as a Pompeian forum, remember, it's a two-story forum, so was this. And here, of course, is an equestrian statue of Julius Caesar, and behind him is the temple of Venus Victrix. And here is the projection, you see, this is the side projection here of what these shops may have looked like. And here's a teacher, and that's what you see with his students in this particular shop. And there's a shop of a money changer with the prerequisite balance, of course. And this is the Senate House itself, which survived. It's still there. And now in front of it, there's the rostra that is in dreadful shape, and then behind it is the forum of Julius Caesar, and in front is the original forum, the Roman forum. Presumably, this is what it looked like when it was in its greatest of shapes. Julius Caesar ordered the restoration of the Senate House, and in fact, with the redistribution of seats inside. And while the restoration was going on, that's why the Senate was meeting at the theater of Pompeii, where there was an additional Courier, an additional building for the meetings, and that's where he was assassinated. Now, so here it is. This is that Courier that we're looking at, and then behind this is this. And this is it from the back. This is the same building from the back, and then the Forum of Julius is here, and in front is the Roman Forum. And then when you walk around in the evening, they project a history of Rome onto the wall of the Courier, like so. And this is the image of Julius Caesar, not the Egyptian one, but the other one, from the other bust. And then here is the Forum. They also show you how he redirected the seats, because presumably the original seats were sort of like the American Senate in the semicircle, but he redirected the seats so there would be like an English Parliament instead, where the two parties would face one another and as such not as united as when sitting in the semicircle. And here is another one, Courier Julia, the third name Courier, Senate House. This one, built in 44, and the alterations within the Courier reduced the prominence of the Senate. Well, frankly, the Senate already by that time did not have nearly as much prominence and as it did in its original stages. But now there was a visual manifestation of this change. Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in the year 44, and his death, because he established peace again. He in fact straightened the rule of government, of central government. He brought to heel the provincial governors who were entirely corrupt. He replaced them. He established a degree of peace in the empire, but then right after his assassination, Rome then will enter another 13 years of civil war until Julius Caesar's grandnephew and an adopted son by the name of Octavian will become, in fact, the first Roman emperor, inaugurating the Roman Empire. So Julius Caesar was the last of the Republic, or the first of the emperors. We have finished this lecture, and again, as we have done already, we will meet and have our discussion. And I'll see you next week.